Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you once again for joining us on a wonderful Shabbat. We thank Yah for the opportunity to join together here virtually to learn about His Word and enjoy everything about Him on His special and holy day. We are going to be talking about salvation and understanding who salvation is for, and this is part one of the series. And this presentation is sponsored by the House of Shiloh Ministries and presented by yours truly, Brother Andrew Bradley. All right? We're going to go ahead and go over the table of contents. All right, let's move to the next slide. And this is a growing lesson, so in part 2 and part 3 of this lesson, this total lesson, this table of contents may be added to, so they will change a little bit. So far what we're going to go over probably in part 1 is probably the introduction of Torah, introduction as a whole. We're going to discuss Torah was delivered to one people. In other words, the law and the purpose behind salvation. Defining the audience of the New Testament, which is a big one. And the correct meaning of Gentile, which is a very big section. Who is nation, since the word nation is used quite a bit. Who is the world, which I think is vital to understanding the whole point of this lesson. And then we're going to wrap it up with who is salvation for, the whole thing in a nutshell. All right? So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get to the introduction. All right. So, according to what we've been taught in our own personal lives, and typically this is what the Christian church teaches us, that salvation is for all. And this is what we hear from nearly every Christian church in the world. However, there are many statements about salvation that contradicts this belief in Scripture. These contradictions need to be reconciled, and the only way to do this is to look at the entire book and not just the new, which a lot of times the church focuses their teachings on. So we will examine the following. Who was delivered the Torah of Yah? Why was salvation required? Who required salvation? Who is the audience of the Scriptures? And does this include the entire world? These are the things that we're really going to be answering throughout this whole lesson. All right? But it's going to be a lot of context, a lot of scriptures. We're going to go through a lot of that. So let's go ahead and begin. Go to the next slide. And let's talk about Torah and that it was delivered to one people. And I believe we have to understand this to really understand salvation. We have to start with the will and the laws of Yah, which is Torah. And Moses was delivered the Torah by Yah, and Moses delivered it to the son of Jacob, the 12 tribes, before they were considered Israel, right? And we'll start in Deuteronomy 28, and I'll read these verses first. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of Yahuwah thy Elohim, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that Yahuwah thy Elohim will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. So Moses is talking to Israel. Well, he's really talking to the elders, because if you think about it, how can one man speak to hundreds of thousands of people? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands. I could barely talk to 100 people in a room. So we will talk later on in the lesson that if you going by truly, the true Hebrew word for nation is not just goy. There's another word that they translate that's called am. But when you look at the scriptures, it will tell you that he wasn't talking to every child of Israel. That makes no sense. And we'll define that later in the lesson. All right? Deuteronomy 30, 19, and 20. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love Yahuwah thy Elohim, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him, For he is thy life and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which Yahuwah sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. These two scriptures are used just to show you that it was given to only one group, to his people. And he makes clear how he wants to be so possessive of them and how he wants you to cleave to him, and that there's a blessing in obedience and a cursing in disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to build on this as we go through these scriptures coming up. You're going to realize that everything is building into the of your understanding, and you're going to realize that only one people had this. Only one people could suffer his judgments because of this. All right, we'll go through that in scripture.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Everybody follow? Any questions?
I'd like to make one small comment, please. For our audience, in case the audience says that the Torah was given to the sons of Jacob, but not given to Israel, I would like for our audience to note that in Genesis chapter 35, verse 10, Elohim said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel or Yisrael." And so he named him Yisrael. So Yisrael existed in Genesis before they ever became slaves in Exodus, right? And the tribes were already in play at that point too. So when we're seeing this in Deuteronomy, these laws are given to the sons of Jacob. They're given to the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, and they were in full force at that point. Okay, so there'll be no questions about that. All right, thank you, brother.
I like that. Thank you for. Oh, go ahead, brother.
I want to say that this right here, to me, the scriptures here make you look at the word world different when it pertains, because the world is not it. It makes you look at it in a different perspective.
It does. And this lesson, we will get to the point in the lesson, which is much further down, where we'll describe world. And you're going to realize that the word world that English translates is actually more than one word. So why would the English translators who knew this keep using the same word? And you're going to see that when we finally get to Gentile. And we will see how Gentile is used to translate multiple different words. Why? Because there's a theme that the translators try to keep so they can be inclusive with other groups of people that were not the target audience.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's mainly due to inclusion.
Mm-hmm. It is due to conclusion. There's absolutely no doubt. That's the motive behind the mistranslation or the purpose misdirection. Mm-hmm. Because why would you take an English word, one English word, and use it for multiple different words with different meanings? Because they had to keep a certain theme and understanding. Mm-hmm. And the audience and context didn't match. And it just takes an eye to want to see so you can understand these problems. And yes, thank you, Minister White, for pointing that out, because what they'll say is that, they weren't called a nation or a nation at that time, but he was renamed before this. Mm-hmm. And the 12 tribes were well established because they were living in that, the region of Egypt. Was that Goshen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they were living there for over 100 years. So you're looking at a very large population.
Correct.
Almost. I'm talking about from the time of Joseph, actually, when Joseph sat on the throne. So you're looking at, or sat next to the throne. So you're looking at, 170 years-ish?
Correct.
Or so. Mm-hmm. So they were well established in size, numbers. They already knew the brother who was who. They all knew that. I was the lineage of Naphtali or Benjamin or Dan or Gad or Yehuda. Mm-hmm. They knew all that.
Mhm.
So thank you for the clarification. Anybody else?
No, thank you.
All right. So let's go ahead and get into this and start with, because the 12 tribes received Yah's Torah, they were the only nation who received his judgments as well. This is what people have a problem with. But this is I'm about to demonstrate why English can mess you up. Let's get a true understanding. And since this verse is short, I'll go ahead and read it myself. Psalms 147, 19 and 20. He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise ye Yahuwah. So there are some that would say right away, did not Sodom and Gomorrah receive his judgment? Yeah, they were judged. We know that. They got an absolute judgment. But what we see in Psalms is related to his Torah, that type of judgment. And let's look at the word used here. It's a Hebrew word, mishpat. Mishpat. Mm-hmm. And in the Strong's Concordance, it simply says a verdict, mm-hmm. pronounced judicially, especially a sentence or formal decree of divine law. See, it's pointing straight to Torah. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Brown Drivers Briggs, the BDB, my 1,100-page book. I like to call this thing right here is a weapon, physically and spiritually. This mm-hmm. book is so big. Decision made in case of the law, which would have been Torah. So here, what they should have said is that he has not dealt so with any nation, and as for his judgments based on his Torah, they have not known them. So see how they know this word means. If I can dig this out and find the definition, these translators could have done so as well. But by making the word say judgment, it throws in a problem with a contradiction. It makes it look like he's lying because there was a judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah and other instances as well. I just use Sodom and Gomorrah because it's so easy for everybody to recall.
Correct.
But this judgment was specific to Torah. So there are examples in the scriptures of other nations receiving judgment, like I said, but the 12 tribes are the only ones who receive judgment based on the Torah. It's just like having a child. You can't discipline a child if you haven't taught the child. But once the child is taught, he's accountable. That's how it is with us. If you have the Torah, you're held accountable. Mm-hmm. It'll be like me going to some far, far southeast nation and telling them that they need to obey Torah. They'll look at you like you're crazy. What are you talking about? I never heard of this. It was never given to me. How are you going to hold me accountable saying that I'm condemned of something I never heard of? That doesn't make sense in common man-made, thought. Hmm. So this is really speaking to the judgments of Torah. All right. Anybody have anything they want to add to this?
One small comment, and it is this. It will become evident as the lesson unfolds that one of the reasons for this misdirection is for them to be included in the area of leadership, in the area of rulership. And why do I say that? Because it tells you in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, and it reads, "The scepter shall not depart from Yahudah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people." So the scepter is in the hand of one of the 12 tribes, mainly the tribe of Yahudah, right? So if they can continue to keep themselves included as a people, then they could keep themselves on top as rulers and reigners of a people that they are not actually a part of. So this is an inclusionary step that they're doing by misdirecting the understanding of people so that they can conclude that this is meant for the whole wide world. For anyone that comes, anyone can have access to it. And this was never in the mind of our Heavenly Father. So that's what I wanted to highlight.
And that's true. And you'll see that theme throughout this whole lesson, like you will see. Constant points where things have been manipulated to be inclusive. But if you think about it, if everyone is inclusive, they're in trouble. Because that means everyone here will suffer the judgment of Torah, not just his people. And there's a lot of Torah breaking to an extreme. So you're telling me that you want to suffer the judgments of the 12 tribes. That's what you're telling me. But that's why Christianity especially teaches the separation, that there is no more Torah. Which is a whole nother lesson. I won't go into that. I don't want to go into that. We're building a lesson for that specific thing too, and that will be coming up later. We'll keep focused. Anybody else?
I wanted to make one more comment, please. There's another scripture. It's in Acts chapter 1, and it's in verse 6. In Acts chapter 1, verse 6. And you see the disciples asking our Messiah, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They're asking our Messiah the question, will the rulership and the authority be handed back, returned back to Israel? It did not say the world. It did not say every nation. It specifically said Israel. The kingdom will be run by Israel. Esau is the end of this world, this present world. And Jacob will be ruler and king over the next one forever. And this is what they don't want us to understand. They want us to continue to believe that this world is currently being run. It's going to continue to be run with Esau mixed in it. He's always a part of it. No, there is a true segregation coming of Esau's kingdom versus Jacob's rulership in his kingdom. And we're seeing that play out right now. We're seeing the ending of one kingdom. It's dying. And the emergence of another one that's also on the horizon. Okay. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide to continue our thought about who was delivered this Torah and the judgments according to Torah. So we understand who has the Torah and who received Yah's judgment. But we don't yet know how this relates to salvation. But we're going to start seeing it now, because we're going to start to talk about the judgments and what they need to be saved from. Not just their physical situation, of course. There's a spiritual component to all this, which is the priority, actually. But in here, I want to focus on the actual physical condition so you can see the dire circumstances of the curses. So in Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 68, the 12 tribes would be cursed according to their disobedience. It lists all the curses. All right, from 15 to 68. So the blessings were listed in 1 through 14. But once you get past 15, all of it's curses. Sounds kind of unbalanced, but it don't take much for Yah to tell you, you're going to be treated really, really well by obeying me. All you got to do and you'll be the greatest nation in the world. But let me pound into your head
Hmm.
curses. And he lists a bunch of them. He could have listed all the blessings if he wanted to. He could have said you would have been blessed in the field, blessed in your house, blessed in whatever. He could have did exactly what he did with curses. He didn't. He wanted to knock home the devastation that comes from disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at 28, 36 through 37 just to talk through it.
Okay.
And I'll continue to keep the thought going. Yahuwah shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee. That means our leaders couldn't even escape this. Unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there shalt thou serve other gods. I kept that purposely.
Mm-hmm.
This is King James Version. Wood and stone. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whether Yahuwah shall lead thee. When I ask anybody, what's an astonishment? People say, oh, you'd be like in awe of them, or just you can't believe, since this is negative, you can't believe the conditions. That if you ask them what's a proverb, they say, oh, just like a saying and a byword. But if you look at these in Hebraic roots, look at the Hebraic roots of these words. Astonishment, proverb, byword don't give it any justice.
Mm-hmm.
You need to see what this means Hebraically. So let's move to the next. Is that clear? No one, any ads? We'll go ahead and move to the next slide.
Okay, none. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's take a look at astonishment, which is shama. All right. Strong's means ruin, desolation, waste. That doesn't sound like astonishment. And the BDB means appallment, horror of a people. They should have said terrible condition instead of astonishment.
Mm-hmm.
And with the proverb word, which is mashal or mashawal, Paleo Hebrew is needed to really understand this. And it means comparison. Often a parable or proverb as a story of comparison. And what is a parable then? A simple story illustrating a moral or religious lesson. All right? We're going to build this. We're going to go through byword, and then we're going to put it all together. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the basic Hebrew meaning for byword, which is shin-e-na, sorry. It's sharp or cutting word or taunt, a taunt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that doesn't really make sense when you know that unless they're a taunt, a bad taunt, or their lives a taunt, making people angry at them. Maybe that's what you can try to put it together. But let's look at it. Let's break it down in the original Hebrew on the next slide, and then we'll put it all together.
Mm-hmm.
So you have sharp, cutting word, taunt. And in the Paleo or Old Original Hebrew, it's piercing, byword, taunt. And the first letter is shin, and it's the two front teeth. Because we know original Hebrew was a pictorial Hebrew. All right, divine power, divine corruption, falsehood. And then you have the seed, which is the nun, which means continue. It's the Torah, which can be open to sprout new life in us. And then you have the yud, or the hand, which is to throw or worship. It's the fivefold ministry that implants the DNA of Yah that is in his Torah, which in you. And then you have the seed again, and then you finally have the hay, which is the ruach of Yah. It's what you can spiritually see. Reveal, behold, to be able to enter the door of the house where salvation is. And there's a lot of understanding that goes with this. But I want to put it together in the context to keep things together. I don't want to lose the audience because some of this needs to be really expounded on, and I think it'll be too much. So let's just focus on what we have here so you can understand the whole meaning. With all we talked about, My word is the falsehood or corruption of the commandments, covenants, and Torah by those who taught Torah, which is the ministry, the fivefold ministry, which is the priest, for example, which prevented life because you disconnected people from the Torah. And without the life, Torah, there was no salvation, which means they were outside the house. They couldn't be let into the house where salvation lies. That's how that relates to the Torah Hebrew. So this is really, byword is saying, an example of a lost way of life without hope through your disobedience, through our disobedience. It was a lost way of life. All right, everybody following me so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's put it all together on the next slide. All right? Restating Deuteronomy 28:37, and thou shalt become an appallment, a horror, a moral, religious lesson to others,
Mm-hmm.
an example of a lost way of life without hope through your disobedience among all nations, whither Yahuwah shall lead thee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tell me that's not rough. Doesn't that sound much different than what was originally presented in English?
Yes, it does.
That is terrible. That's a terrible state to be in.
Mm-hmm.
All right? And Deuteronomy 28:46, and they shall be unto thee for a sign and for a wonder upon thy seed forever. This falls in line with verse 37. And this means you can't run from this.
True.
All right? And then he says in the very last verse, in 68, and Yahuwah shall bring thee into Egypt. And when he says Egypt, the actual root word in Hebrew is mitzvah, which means bondage. So this is a mistranslation as well, and I figured I would just speak to it. So he's really saying, and Yahuwah shall bring thee into bondage again with ships. And if you think about it, Israel shares a big, big border with Egypt. Why would you need to go into Egypt with ships? Now, I have heard the argument. This is what the argument has been by those who try to explain this away and say this does not go towards the slave trade, for example. Well, the northern kingdom of Israel, instead of walking down the coastal region all the way down in Egypt, it would have been just faster to catch a boat into Egypt. That's what I've been told, or I've heard. But there's a problem with that. The amount of slaves that could have easily been brought over on a boat at that time in those type of ships would not have been sufficient to keep up with the slave needs of Egypt at that time. The ships were small in comparison of what you saw in the 1400s and 1500s when the slave trade really began during this Inquisition period. You could put 200-300 people on those ships easily. So it wouldn't have made sense. It wouldn't have been cost effective. And you can look at that and look at the history of that if you wish. You will see that. So no, that doesn't make sense. And why would you go to the northern kingdoms to grab slaves when you can go right into Judah and grab them? Right into Benjamin and grab them? They're right there. You don't need to go all the way north. And each tribe was a nation in themselves. They were quite large, millions. They were huge. So why go up to the north, bring a boat down, when you can cross a border and be right next to Judah? It doesn't make sense. And then he continues and says, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. He's talking about you will not see your land again. And there you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. That should not make sense to anyone. Why would you go into slavery and then nobody buys you? Is that profitable? No. Because the Hebraic word for here does not mean buy. It's kana, and it's of Elohim originating, creating, redeeming his people. Now, if you look at the actual paleo, it means to build a nest or home, a place for safety, a place to gather your seed. In other words, no one will save you or provide a place of safety, like a home or a nest.
Mm-hmm.
No one is going to redeem you. He's telling you no one's going to redeem you. That means he's not going to redeem you.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why these verses have been brought up is because I wanted people to understand that by understanding what the curses are, it starts to paint a picture of who the people are and what they needed to be saved from. They needed to be saved spiritually because they were disconnected from Yah, and we'll talk about that when we describe the word lost. But they also needed to be saved physically because of the consequences of the curses as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's important to understand the delivery of the Torah, because the consequence of disobeying it puts a certain people in a condition that requires salvation as well, spiritually and physically. It's very important because Yahushua came to restore the kingdom, and we talked about that in our previous lesson. That kingdom come. And we talked about how the spiritual kingdom is a requirement of the physical kingdom. So Yahushua came for the spiritual kingdom restoration, restoring his people to Yah, the straight path, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it as well. That's the most important part. But there's a physical kingdom that needs to be restored too, which we know is coming. Anybody want to add to this?
I have a small area I'd like to highlight that supports your statement. Another way you can look at this to ascertain that the people that were taken into Egypt back during the time of Joseph, the people that came out of Egypt, that Exodus, had nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Is this. When you go back and you read Deuteronomy, and it says that you will be taken on ships, and then you will serve other gods that your fathers did not know, right? Well, you can read and find out that the gods that they served in Egypt, they were all too familiar with. And you can find it in the book of Amos, for example, chapter 5 and verse 26. And he says in Amos chapter 5, verse 26, he says, "But you have carried the tabernacles of your gods of Moloch and Chion, your images, the star of your God, which you made to yourselves," right? And that's in Amos 5. And then you read it again in Acts chapter 7 and verse 43. "You have taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your God Remphan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore I will send you into exile beyond Babylon." So the gods that they were worshiping, even when they were coming out of Egypt, they were still worshiping these gods. So they did not worship a God that they did not know at that time. So we know that that prophetic word was not applicable to that first Exodus, that it is applicable now to what has transpired in these last few hundreds of years. And it had nothing to do with that first set. You understand what I'm saying? Okay.
Oh, no, that's excellent.
Okay.
That's excellent.
So that's the only
and I didn't
piece
point
I wanted
out.
to. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's all I wanted to highlight. Well, just in case anyone would have any doubts about what you're saying, I just wanted to give another piece to support what it is you're saying, that we didn't go there. We didn't go to Egypt, back to Egypt, the true Mitzrayim, the true Egypt, by ships. That was not the that's not what Deuteronomy was referring to. It was referring to the transatlantic slave trade, where we did cross the ocean, where we did come into to learn about gods that we've never heard of before. Never. And nor our forefathers. It was totally new to us. So it had nothing to do with
Mm-hmm.
the first set of the type of slavery or enslavement that took place in Egypt. It had nothing to do with that one. But being brought to America and other coastal areas, Jamaica, right, Barbados, St. Thomas, all those other areas. That is what it's referring to. That's where we learned about the other gods, right? Of wood.
That's right.
Of wood.
That's right. And if you don't think that's true, look up the Inquisitions and look what they did to the Jews in Spain and Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
If they did not convert, they were shipped. This is their own history of Spain and Portugal. This is not something I'm making up. And you got to use some critical thinking with this too, because it just makes sense. They were shipped to the Canary Islands and then to the coast of Africa, the slave coast of Africa. Tell me this then. If this was, by the way, the early 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. It was estimated in Spain alone there was over 800,000 Hebrews that had been living there since they were exiled by Greece and Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Even Babylon exiled some up that way. But more was exiled after Rome Hellenized the region through conquering and sent more up. And they sent some of the best. They sent the priestlyhood, the king, the royalty line, which meant Judah, because that's what they believed in shipping. You're not going to give an ally some of the average. You're going to go to the priesthood, the royalty, and send them. So a lot of the people that were shipped to Spain and Portugal were of the line of Judah. And all the history books speak of the dark complexion of the Jews of Spain and Portugal. They were as black as any Ethiopian, some of these history books say.
Mm-hmm.
And that they were, when the Inquisitions came, due to the Portuguese and the Spain combining kingdoms, the wife of the of Spain wanted something to be done to the Jews, I believe, if I can recall my history correctly. And it resulted in an Inquisition, the Inquisition that started in Spain first, and then moved to Portugal when the Hebrews tried to run, resulting in millions being killed because they would not convert to Christianity, a religion that they never knew until they ran into it during the Christian conversions of many of the countries around them. They got shipped to the coast of Africa, and I have to say this one more thing. Have you seen a white Jew in the coast of Africa being shipped off in slave ships? No. But all the history books will tell you who they were. You just have to go look for them. It's just not going to be given to you. And in fact, a lot of those ships were owned by Jewish ship owners, which is also well documented. So all you got to do is just look at the history and dig, and you'll find it. You'll find it. Anybody else?
Just a short comment. What would be a greater humiliation than to take the royal seed and to make them slaves? Which is what they did. They suffered the greater humiliation to go from not a common person. We're not talking, even though the commoners were also enslaved, but to take the royal seed, the royal house, royal lineages, and to cause them to be less than a commoner, slaves. What greater humiliation could there be?
None. And that slavery was not.
Once you take the head, the rest is coming. So to break the governing tribe that sets the laws and regulations for the other 11 is breaking the very foundation that Israel stood on.
That's true.
Yep. Yeah, and that makes sense. That makes sense. Not only were they the governing head, but they were probably the toughest tribe as well. Gave Rome the fits, the blues for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Long time. So I agree with you. You get rid of Judah, or the whole thing can come down then. They knew that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Yehuda was so tough to deal with. They really didn't mess with Yehuda much as long as there wasn't much of an uproar because they were difficult. They were difficult to deal with.
And do you know that
All right.
the prophecy came true when they began to request for the royal seeds to be shipped as slaves? The prophecy that was written became true, and this is what the prophecy said: "You were once the head, and now you become the tail. Where you used to be above, you'll be at the lowest point." It became true during that transatlantic slave trade. Mm-hmm.
It said the people, they'll be of a land you did not know. That's one more thing. They were well familiar with Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
Middle Persia, so Babylon. You had the Greek islands, including the region we call Turkey today. You had the peninsula, the Arabic Peninsula now, whatever you call it now. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. You had the bulk of Africa that was easily accessible. So that region was well established. And Paul went all the way to Italy. So a lot of Europe, Western Europe, was really understood by the Yahudim. So they're saying a land that you have not seen or known.
Mm-hmm.
They were even familiar with lands east of India. So this supports what we're just talking about. Also, they said of a people, of a language you never heard,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know, of a people with a fierce countenance, swift as the eagle. And many of the European nations that were in the slave trade had an eagle as a symbol. And the languages they were not familiar with, especially English.
Mm-hmm.
So they're right. I mean, it was fierce. It was fierce. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Let's continue. So we understand again who was given Torah and Yah's covenants and judgments, right? We understand that. There was no other nation in the world with curses that made them a horror, a lesson to others, and an example of a lost way of life. Without hope, whom no one can save them from. And I can tell you now, I can go do my ancestry and it'll just go right to slavery, and that's it. So you lose a lot. And with the disobedience of Torah and the covenant, the curses followed Israel forever. And this was done by Yah himself. Isaiah 42:24. Who gave Jacob for a spoil and Israel to the robbers? Did not Yahuwah? He against whom we have sinned.
Mm-hmm.
For they would not walk in his ways, neither were they obedient unto his Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all ain't nothing to play with. You're not going to lie. So these were the people who needed to be saved from the curses, saved from their own habitual disobedience that led to their cursed condition, and only Yahuwah could redeem them. That's what Yahusha means.
Mm-hmm.
Or Yahushua means Yahuwah, our Redeemer, our Deliverer, our Savior. All right. Any questions so far?
No, thank
with
you.
this? All right. Now, since we got an understanding of who needs this, who really the salvation was for, in a brief way, because we're meaning who needed to be saved, and those who were delivered Torah. And there's more to this, a lot more to this. But for the direction we're going to take the lesson, because we need to focus on what the church looks upon salvation as. We're going to now move into defining the audience of the new covenant, as they call it, the New Testament. This is important because We already just talked about, we understood who delivered the Torah. We understood who suffered judgment. We understood who needed to be saved, and only who could save them is Yah. But we're going to need to now understand the audience of the New Testament, so-called New Testament, or New Covenant, they say, so we can understand that they are the same people. Because what we have in our church is a separation.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move here. Let's move to the next slide. So we have discussed, like we said, the Torah given to only one nation, Israel, and Israel is the only nation to be judged by Torah, resulting in the curses that are still affected them today. And we talked about Deuteronomy 28, made it clear that no one could save Israel from the curses except Yah. And Yahuwah planned for this. And Jeremiah, or Yirmiyahu, prophesied it. Brother, you mind reading for me, please?
Sure. Cool. Jeremiah 31, chapter 31, verse 31 to 33. Behold, the days come, saith Yahuwah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith Yahuwah. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith Yahuwah, I will put my Torah in their inward parts, and write in their hearts, and will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people.
I picked this verse because it's specific to what's spoken of in the so-called New Testament. Now, of course, Isaiah speaks of our Messiah specifically, but I wanted to use this prophecy by Yirmiyahu because he speaks of the quote-unquote New Covenant. And, so I wanted to make it clear that what the mediator that Yahusha is to us, and Paul said he is the mediator of the better covenant. And he quotes this prophecy. So the very Messiah that the church speaks of, they ignore how Paul correlates Jeremy or Yirmiyahu 31 through 33 with the Messiah. And it specifically speaks of the Hebrews only. So does that make sense to everyone? This is just the beginning. We're going to get into actually the letters of Paul and so on to really get into the audience that the New Testament really references when it comes to all of it. Anybody want to add to anything?
I just wanted to make a small highlight to what you already have, and that is, it says that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Yehudah. The world is not in there. And it's going to be very important that we continue to highlight this point so you can understand salvation and why salvation is for a particular people and what that word salvation means, because we've been taught that salvation means being saved from hell or from going to hell. And of course, that's for anybody, right? But what we're speaking of, is something way past that. So I just wanted to highlight that one more time. Thank you, brother.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Minister. Anybody else?
No.
All right. Well, let's get into some fun Paul scriptures. Because we know Paul, next screen, is a source of a lot of confusion for a lot of the Christian audience in reference to what he speaks of. And of course, whenever you're dealing with his letters, especially Romans, you need to be prayerful and really study it over and over again to understand it, especially with the twisting of the languages that English has done over the years in their translations.
Mm-hmm.
So I was speaking to Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and how Paul referenced it. And here it is. Here's the very verse. And brother, go ahead and read this for me as well.
I got it.
Go ahead, please.
Hebrew 8:8-10. So finding fault with them, he said, Behold, the days come, said Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Yahudah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, said Adonai. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, said Adonai. I will put my Torah in their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them elders, and they shall be to me a people.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Minister Ronnie. This points to how Paul taught. We're going to have to understand that the New Testament, as we see it today, did not come into existence until nearly 400 CE. That's nearly. I'm not saying the letters weren't written. And these are letters, by the way. They're not books. They're letters. So, and they weren't written immediately after our Messiah's death either, or during his life.
Mm-hmm.
They were written many years, decades after his life, and weren't put together until the Roman Catholic Church decided to do it. It's all in the history books or hidden books. You got to do some digging to get them because they don't want you to know this, especially since they separated two books and called the original scriptures old, and these letters and stuff that they compiled as a New Testament. And then when they translated them, they messed with the wording to be all inclusive. And you're going to see that many times in this lesson. Many times in the lesson and throughout all these sections that we're going to be working with. So Paul is demonstrating his teaching of the original scriptures. He didn't get this from some New Testament book that he had in his hand. It didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about this New Testament, this new salvation, this new covenant that the mediator, our Messiah, is the mediator of, a better one. This is what he's talking about. And this proves the audience because, of course, we know that Jeremiah, is talking to the Hebrews. Well, why Paul is bringing it right back to us, right here in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So why would the audience change just because it's in a letter now? If I quoted the Old Testament, does it change the audience and its purpose just because I decide to do it thousands of years later? No. But that's what we're taught.
Mm-hmm.
Or we're taught we can define the audiences as I want. Or that Scripture has multiple translations or multiple truths. You can define it in multiple ways, which is a lie, one of the greatest lies of Christianity. That is a bold-faced lie. What you're saying to me is that Yah's word can mean whatever you feel it means. That's exactly what that means. It's all perspective. That's what they tell you. That many versions of the Bible, there's many versions of Bible with various meanings and understandings. That's a lie. That's a lie that Christianity created.
Mm-hmm.
There was only two ways to deal with the scriptures, the right and wrong way. Not a bunch of, that's why you have in the church now thousands of denominations, thousands, because they're taught that it's all a perspective.
Mm-hmm.
It's ambiguity. It's ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lie. We have to get out of that and understand that there's only one way to understand these scriptures to your benefit, and it's to do it in the way of truth. And you can't do it if you're being taught through the same lenses that the lies came from. You got to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So far, in the very first part of what Paul's written, we already know that he's referencing the old for the audience today. And now we're going to get into more of who is being spoken of. Anybody want to add any more to this?
Just another short highlight. You find it in conversation, and you're in conversations with other Christians. You'll hear something like, "Well, that's your understanding. My understanding is this," when there shouldn't be either one of those, because the scripture interprets itself. It doesn't need you to give it an understanding, right? So with that mindset, the scripture becomes fluid. You understand what I mean? It is the scripture becomes as fluid as the gender category that's prevalent today. Because remember, there were two genders
That's so true.
in the beginning. There was male and female, but now you have a whole lot of stuff in between, right? LBGTQ, XYZ, and they're still adding. So now the scriptures become fluid, and then you end up with these various denominations, and it should not be, because really there's only one truth. But you look at it today, you have a billion versions of the same truth. How is this possible? This is demonic. This is the doctrine of demons and devils. Okay. All right. Thank you, brother.
So true. And it's one of the biggest barriers. And we pick on Christianity. It's not because we don't understand or we're just ignorant and hard on them. We're not being that way. We came from it.
Exactly.
So we have a great understanding of the problems that Christianity has. And because we were in Christianity decades before we came out of it.
Yes.
We didn't poke our head in there and stepped out. We stayed in that mud deep. I was under the church. Okay. So to get out of it was a great, great, great effort, and a heavy effort, and a serious and very concerning effort.
And costly.
But when I got out, I started to see the truth, and it came to me like a fire hose, drinking out of a fire hose, and it was just shocking what you will learn. So when we say these things, it's the truth when we say that the scriptures have only one way of understanding it, and that's a truth, and they do it themselves. And then what's really funny is that they'll say, "Well, that's yours," but the funny that's your understanding. But the problem I find when they say that is that their understanding lines up with a whole bunch of other people, so they understand something to their convenience, to their life, to their standards, to your own righteousness. Because if the church taught truly what righteousness is alone, what righteous means, all this confusion would stop. Because righteous simply means obeying the divine laws of God. That is in your concordances, by the way. That's not my definition. That will stop everything. That will stop everything. Anybody else?
That's it.
All right. So before we get into everything now, what we're going to start really getting to Yahuwah's purpose and direction, which will really be the beginning of understanding the audience, and then we'll get into the disciples' writings. We're going to go ahead and end part 1 here. Thank you all for joining us. Please join in on part 2, where we start to really get into the meat of the new covenant audience and see who salvation is really for.
Shabbat Shalom to everyone, to those who are present, to those who are online, and also to those who will join us in the very near future.